watch right now on the Front News project. Crimea has been shaken once again. HUR drones have destroyed Russian air defense systems. The Kerch Bridge is in the crosshairs of the Ukrainian armed forces. 600 Chinese military personnel are already in Moscow. New North Koreans are also heading to Russia. A new battle is looming. Meanwhile, all of Russia is under attack from explosions in Tatarstan, Engels and the Bryansk region. And this is just the beginning. Watch fiery, intense and blazing footage from the front lines right now. It's the fourth year of the full-scale war that Putin's Russia started on Ukrainian soil. The Ukrainian armed forces continue to heroically defend not only their homeland, but the entire civilized world from the aggression of Kremlin war criminals. Greetings! This is Front News. I'm Volodymyr Timoshenko. For the next 30 minutes, you'll get the truth about the war uncovered by our journalists from the hottest combat zones. So, are you ready? Then let's begin. And we're starting right away with exclusive material. Drones from the main intelligence directorate of Ukraine destroyed Russian air defense systems in Crimea. Yes, the special unit Ghosts has clearly weakened the Russian air defense. And in general, throughout the week, the temporarily occupied Crimea has been shaken more than once. In particular, we're talking about the attack on the airfield in Jankoy. And enemy military facilities in Tatarstan, Engels, Bryansk, Belgorod and Saratov regions of the Russian Federation have also come under attack. In a minute, we'll show you exclusive footage. Meanwhile, NATO is stating that Putin is prepared to wage war in Ukraine until 2027. At the same time, the alliance countries themselves are preparing to fight against the Russian Federation. NATO will mine the entire border with Russia from Finland to Poland. This is at least some protection against a potential Russian invasion. Let's look at all the details. Russia has been shaken once again. 5 regions and the temporarily occupied Crimea have come under drone attacks. The attack on military facilities in Crimea began late in the evening. Explosions thundered in different areas. The Jankoy airfield, which is used as a logistics hub for supplying troops and equipment, as well as a base for attack helicopters, came under attack again. At least 2 explosions occurred in Kerch and near Cape Chowda. Things are also unsettled in Rostov. There are reports of a drone attack on an oil depot.
Wow, that was incredibly fast. Did you actually see it happen?
Yeah.
Wow.
What is that?
It's at the oil refinery.
Taganrog also did not escape the attention of the friendly drones. The local Atlant Aero plant, which specializes in components for combat UAVs and control systems, came under attack. This is a key facility in the Russian military-industrial complex.
Can you just imagine? I was simply walking right here, and over there it was like, how am I even still alive at this very moment?
And as usual, UAVs also paid a visit to Saratov and Engels. And while Russians are dealing with the aftermath of the attack, the occupiers are expanding the use of motorcycles along the front line in Ukraine. According to the Institute for the Study of War, Putin's army is ready to use this tactic in all future wars.
The Ukrainian defense forces having superiority in FPV drones and accordingly in strike capability, primarily referring to Western strike systems, whose tactical and technical characteristics are 1.5 to 2 times greater than their Soviet and Russian counterparts in the occupiers' arsenal, are forced to compensate for the lack of armored support during assault operations by using cars and motorcycles, that is, high-speed vehicles, which, according to the Russian side, should allow them to avoid losses of both armored vehicles and, accordingly, personnel.
According to NATO estimates, Russia's economic capabilities allow Putin to continue the war against Ukraine at least until 2027. However, in this scenario, it is believed that the Russian defense industry is already operating at its limit, and further increases in weapons production are impossible.
And a telling example is that a Russian factory producing microelectronics for aircraft and military equipment, the Stavropol Enterprise A, has halted production due to losses from fulfilling government contracts and mounting debts. This is the real state of the Russian economy. At this point, we can say that it is essentially overheated. The entire economy of the Russian Federation has been switched, exclusively directed entirely to a war footing. Accordingly, the Russian political leadership fully understands that the possibility of ending the war in Ukraine would in fact be a catastrophe for the Russian economy.
Despite the problems in the Kremlin, Poland, Finland, and the Baltic states are ready to mind their borders with Russia and create a new Iron Curtain in Europe. All these countries have announced their withdrawal from the Ottawa Convention, which prohibits the use of anti-personnel mines, amid discussions about a possible Russian invasion of NATO countries.
These actions by NATO countries should be regarded as an appropriate response to the actions of the Russian side as it expands its military presence directly at the borders. When it comes to the Baltic countries, we are talking about Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, as well as Finland and Sweden. In other words, the Baltic countries are fully aware of the increased threat from the Russian Federation in the event of possible direct offensive actions aimed at seizing the territories of these countries.
And in addition, the Kremlin is increasing its military presence in Africa. Moscow is sending tanks, armored vehicles, howitzers, electronic warfare equipment, and other gear to its African core using cargo ships.
The Russian Federation is trying to use its military presence on the African continent as a way to replenish its treasury by exploiting the natural resources of these countries. First and foremost, this refers to gold, oil, gas, and uranium mines. Additionally, there is diamond mining and the use of the human resources of African countries to replenish the ranks of the armed forces of the Russian Federation.
As we can see, Prigozhin has long since passed away, but his enterprise lives on and thrives. But for how long? And now, let's analyze the operational situation on Blazing Pokrovsk front. Let's be honest, this is yet another sacred goal for Putin and his entire pack. Accordingly, the situation here is also tense to the limit. On the Pokrovsk front, since the beginning of this day, the occupiers have made 26 attempts to push our defenders from their positions in the areas of the settlements of Poltavka, Malinovka, Shevchenko-Persha, Mirna, Mirolyubivka, Promin, Lisivka, Mirnograd, Novosergiivka, Udakne Alexeyevka, Novokrainka, and towards Vladimirovka. The defense forces are holding back the enemy's onslaught and have already repelled 21 attacks. Another 5 clashes are still ongoing. A day of mourning in Dnipro. The number of victims from the enemy strike in the city has risen to 20. More than 300 people have been wounded. Over 1,500 remain in hospitals to this day. The Dnipro City Council has called the scale of destruction unprecedented. Nearly 50 apartment buildings have been damaged and 40 educational institutions have been shattered. TSN journalist Anastasia Neverna will tell and show how Dnipro is recovering from this hellish attack.
Not a single window left intact, doors deformed and torn out. These dormitories are located right next to the epicenter of the explosions. They took the brunt of the blasts. Dozens of residents were injured, and only by a miracle were there no fatalities.
Go ahead. And 1, 2, 3.
Some residents have already managed to get to their apartments. Victoria and her daughter are searching for anything that survived. They say that of the rooms that were recently renovated, almost nothing is left.
Everything there is covered in glass. Everything was thrown out. We had installed new windows. That saved us a little. We saw doors flying off, glass shattering. We ran out like this, over the glass, over the doors, everything covered in dust.
The children weren't hurt because they managed to run out into the hallway in time. The youngest, the 4-year-old, still can't recover from the shock.
The child said she won't come back here. She was very scared. She told us to look for a new home. Yesterday she didn't eat or drink anything. She doesn't want anything. And now, when she woke up, she looked at the situation and said, "Mom, we're not going back there."
A similar situation is happening throughout the entire dormitory. People are closing their windows and looking for something to cover the broken doors.
We don't have a balcony, and I don't have any doors. At least last night, they managed to put the windows back in somehow. Everything is mixed up with glass bedding, clothes, everything. We'll have a place to stay for a day or two, but who will need us after that?
3 ballistic missiles struck this area at short intervals. As is typical for this type of weapon, the strikes happened shortly after the alert was announced, so most people didn't have time to reach shelter. Sergei and his son were already entering the building when the explosion happened nearby. He recalls, he barely managed to shield his child with his own body.
We were just stepping outside, and at that moment, everything started collapsing. Something hit us, glass or debris, I don't know what exactly. They stitched up the wound, put a bandage on it, and otherwise, it's more or less okay.
The passengers of the train coming from Odessa were also affected. There are more than 50 of them. One of the missiles exploded nearby. Miraculously, there were no fatalities there. 10 people were injured, including children. In the first hours after the attack, ambulances could barely keep up with transporting the wounded. Hospitals were receiving severely injured patients every 5 to 10 minutes. Currently, more than 1,500 patients are under medical supervision. The condition of nearly 20 of them is critical. 13 children also remain in the hospital.
All the patients who are admitted have mine explosion injuries. They all suffered shrapnel wounds to the head, eyes, limbs, and abdomen. The patients in critical condition have traumatic brain injuries, chest injuries, abdominal injuries, and wounds to their limbs.
The destruction caused during this attack was described by the Dnipro city administration as the worst since the start of the full-scale invasion. More than 50 apartment buildings, dozens of private homes, hundreds of cars, hospitals, clinics, and over 30 schools and kindergartens were damaged. Since yesterday, victims have been lining up in huge queues to file police reports about their damaged property.
The roof, the windows, the glass, everything is damaged. Of course, it's stressful. And thank God that everyone is alive and well, that things turned out this way.
I work in a kiosk. Yesterday I was showered with glass there. I fell to the floor and the shelves fell on me. I live in a house nearby.
And how is your house?
No windows, no doors. I ran over to take a look. And in the evening I covered up what I could.
Utility workers have already removed almost 1,000 tons of debris and rubble from the impact sites.
And in general, up to 700 Shaheds in a single attack, and almost every night, this is the grim forecast from Ukrainian military for the coming autumn. How are the armed forces of Ukraine preparing to counter this hellish threat? Our journalists have been looking into this question.
The Russians are ramping up drone attacks. The occupiers are now launching hundreds of Shahids across Ukrainian territory. And it seems this is not the limit. Now Ukrainians are even being advised to be ready for such attacks every day. Allegedly, starting from September, the aggressor country could launch 700 Shahids at Ukraine daily. But is this really the case?
If we're talking specifically about Shaheds, I think that number is greatly exaggerated. By the end of 2024, the Russians were able to produce about 70 drones per day. If you look at the statistics for drone usage up to and including May 2025, as the president said, that's 11,200. Divide that by the number of days and you get 73 drones. This generally matches the statistics provided by the general staff and all other observations.
Recently, the Russians have indeed increased their drone production capacity, but we're not talking about hundreds per day. Currently, the occupiers can roll out up to 90 Shahids per day from the assembly line. At the same time, Russia is planning to build another plant for UAV production.
In order to significantly increase drone production several times over, say, to 700 drones a day, or 500 or even 300, that's a task the Russians are currently not capable of handling. Even if 25,000 South Koreans come here, each bringing their own brick, and they are all already trained and prepared for drone production, I still think that in any case, this task cannot be accomplished by September. If you recall the procedure for launching the plant in Yelabuga, when the buildings were already ready and it was only necessary to train and master the technological processes, then only 9 months after the launch of this project, the Russians were able to produce 30 drones per month. 30 drones a month, not per day, but per month.
So this is a problem for the future. Although, of course, we need to prepare for this now. Another question is, where did the figure of 500 or 700 drones that Russia supposedly can produce per day come from? Most likely, they were talking not only about Shahed drones, but also about decoy drones.
There are Shahed drones and there are decoy drones. The production of decoys can be organized in much larger quantities. But our air defense systems have, so to speak, the signature of each target. And analyzing the signature of these targets generally allows us to distinguish a decoy from a real drone. The problem arose when these drones started being armed, especially in the frontline regions, with warheads of 1.5, 2, or even 3 kilograms. And then it's no longer just a decoy drone, it becomes a strike drone.
At the same time, we should be prepared that attacks by hundreds of Shaheds are the new reality. It's just that the Russians won't be launching them daily, but with intervals.
Another thing is that the Russians can stockpile them, as they are doing now. They can skip several days, launching 30, 40, 50 drones at night. I mean Shaheds, I'm only talking about Shaheds, and stockpile them, and then strike, say, with 150 Shaheds at once. That's possible now. Maybe by increasing the intervals, they'll increase the number of attacks. The attacks have become considerably more intense because the Russian forces are now consistently using the tactic of amassing Shahed drones at a specific concentrated location. They can then launch 50, 70, or even 80 of these unmanned aerial vehicles at a single targeted location.
And this in turn puts an incredible strain on Ukrainian air defense systems. It's extremely difficult to shoot down that many drones. As a result, Ukraine is now actively seeking ways to counter such attacks, and there are already some developments.
A very active program for interceptor drones is now being rolled out. There is a lot of discussion about using light aircraft. A government resolution on this matter has been issued. Well, now it turns out that the DFG will finally be responsible for, there will be a specific structure responsible for combating Shaheds. I believe that the most effective countermeasure is to equip light aircraft with interceptor drones or small missiles. But I don't mean Tucanos, and I don't mean the same shark that's now started circulating online.
And when an effective countermeasure is found, the attacks will become less intense. After all, the Russians' new strategy will no longer work. In any case, there is also some good news. For now, we shouldn't expect 700 Shaheds per day, although undoubtedly it's better to be prepared for this in the future.
And now it's time to analyze the operational situation on the Lyman front. The bloody rampage of the enemy army continues here as well. On the Lyman front, the invading army attacked 11 times near the settlements of Grekovka, Novi Mir, Redko Dub, and in the directions of Olgovka, Kolodyazi, Zelenaya Dolina, and Torskoye. The defense forces stopped 9 enemy attempts to advance. 2 clashes are still ongoing. 600 Chinese military personnel will come to Russia to gain combat experience. And according to Ukrainian experts, this experience will likely be gained on the fronts of the Russian-Ukrainian war. How should such an internship for Chinese military personnel be interpreted? And could it become a precursor to Beijing providing a much larger contingent at the disposal of Russian occupiers, as has already happened with soldiers from North Korea? Let's try to figure this out together.
Russia and China are expanding their military cooperation. According to Ukrainian intelligence, the Kremlin will receive about 600 Chinese military personnel as early as this year. This was reported by Kyiv Post, citing a source in the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine.
The Kremlin has decided to give Chinese military personnel the opportunity to study and implement the experience gained by the Russian army in the war against Ukraine, said a source at the main intelligence directorate to Kyiv Post.
Chinese military personnel will be sent to Russia for internships. They will be trained at the bases and training centers of the armed forces of the aggressor country. The main focus is on training tank crews, artillerymen, engineers, and air defense specialists. According to intelligence, the goal is to prepare China to counter Western weaponry. And as emphasized by the main intelligence directorate, this is not about a technical exchange, but about a strategic rapprochement between the two armies. This is part of a broader military coordination between Moscow and Beijing against the collective West.
It is quite obvious that right now for the People's Republic of China, the experience of real combat operations against a Western-style army with Western weaponry, such encounters and how to counter them is extremely important. Accordingly, for China, which is preparing for a possible confrontation with the United States, this experience is extremely valuable. And that is why right now contact with Russian Federation is, of course, primarily aimed at obtaining this direct experience.
Ukraine has already encountered a similar scheme. Previously, Russia hosted soldiers from North Korea on its territory. At first, it all started with limited training, but soon thousands of North Korean soldiers joined the Russian army in its war against Ukraine.
But regarding China, I think there will not be any official involvement of Chinese military personnel, specifically the Chinese army in the war against Ukraine. Most likely it will be limited to further joint exercises, which happen quite frequently with the Russian army. But on the other hand, we remember that the Russian Federation is actively mobilizing by recruiting mercenaries from China. We recall how our main intelligence directorate and other agencies directly reported the participation of more than 150 Chinese military personnel in the ranks of the Russian occupying army. And this precisely shows that even the transfer and adoption of such experience and the sharing of relevant knowledge how to counter Western equipment, how to deal with new tactics, both in offense and defense, can ultimately lead to a situation where certain Chinese citizens on a voluntary basis as mercenaries may later go directly to fight on the side of the Russian aggressor.
And although China formally continues to insist on a diplomatic resolution to the Russian-Ukrainian war, in reality it is becoming ever more deeply involved in the confrontation. Earlier, Western media reported that industrial facilities involving Chinese specialists are already operating on Russian territory, and now there is also military training provided to a country that ruthlessly attacks Ukrainian cities every single day.
In reality, Russia is very afraid of the influence that China now holds over them, because the total dependence they currently have on China threatens not only their sovereignty in the future, but even the very existence of Russia as a state. This is especially true for the territories that border China. I'm not saying that these territories will be taken over by China, but the possibility that puppet states could be created there, which would indeed be under China's control, is very, very likely in the future, especially since China looks ahead, not like we do, for 3 or 5 years. They look 50 or even 100 years into the future. Well, that's their strategy. That's how they think. So whether China wants it or not, friendship is friendship, but business is business.
Against the backdrop of statements about supporting peace, China is sending its military personnel to Russia. For now, it's for training. But in the context of a full-scale war, such actions are hard to call peaceful from the Ukrainian side's perspective.
And now let's move to the Kramatorsk and Toretsk sectors of the front. The enemy is becoming more ferocious here as well. In the Kramatorsk direction, the enemy attacked the defense forces' positions twice, towards Markove and Bilahora. In the Toretsk direction today, the enemy attacked 5 times in the areas of Yablonevka and Rusiniv Yar. At this moment, one engagement is ongoing. The medical infrastructure of the city of Bilatva in the Kiev region became the target of a Russian attack this week. At least 2 private clinics and 1 state clinic were damaged. 1 woman was killed, 6 people were injured, including 2 rescuers who had arrived on the scene. In addition, a hotel and entertainment complex was destroyed, cars were burned out, and windows in apartments were shattered. A report from TSN journalist Dimitro Frudak from the scene is coming up next for your attention.
The most terrifying night since the start of Russia's full-scale aggression against Ukraine, that's how the residents of Bilatva described the events of last night.
At 1 in the morning, when everything started exploding, there were 8 explosions in the same place. It was very frightening, and with a small child, it was scary. One explosion, then another. You know, you couldn't even lift your head.
This neighborhood in the center of Bilatva suffered the most. Here, the medical center was almost completely destroyed, as well as a hotel. The lounge chairs where just yesterday people were relaxing. Tomorrow they had planned to celebrate Ivan Kupala here, but everything changed just a few hours. Because for several hours in a row, Shaheds kept hitting this place. In another part of Bilatva, locals still stopped to look at and take pictures of what's left of the Russian metal. See Jaran too? In this development, a lot of windows were blown out. In addition to apartment buildings, at least 2 medical facilities were also damaged. These are the women's clinic, the maternity hospital, and a private medical facility.
The Shahed drone got stuck in a tree, and a significant part of its engine ended up with people on the 2nd floor of the building.
In this residential complex, we met a citizen of the Netherlands. Mr. George came to Ukraine 10 days ago to see his beloved Halina. But that night, they had to spend in a shelter in this basement.
We clearly heard a drone, a distinct and unmistakable sound.
Then we heard a drone, something like a motorcycle.
The room was shaking, there was dust everywhere. The children were crying, they were scared.
Who is responsible for this? From these affected businesses, they immediately started removing whatever property could still be saved. And we are very glad that we managed to save the national flag.
We preserved it, we took it down because it was in the place where there was such a blaze and where the strike hit. We took it down because with us, no army at all will ever be able to defeat the people under such a flag.
The locals are trying to return to a more or less normal life as quickly as possible and believe in just punishment for those who wronged them.
Let everything that they have done come back to them 1,000,000 times over so that they feel it themselves.
And now, an analysis of the situation on the Oriven and Prinipovski fronts. The Russian world continues here as well to destroy, kill and maim. On the Orikiv front, the aggressor carried out airstrikes on the areas of Stepnohirsk, Primorske and Kamyanske. On the Prinipovski front, the enemy attacked our defenders' positions 4 times without success. At the same time, they launched an airstrike with unguided rockets on Kazatske. The number of cases where the occupiers used poisonous chemical substances is increasing. In 3.5 years of the full-scale war, there have already been more than 9,000 such incidents. 2,500 of our defenders have suffered injuries and burns of varying severity as a result. The Russians, of course, ignore all international conventions banning chemical weapons. All the details are in the report by our colleagues from the Specor project.
These are exactly the very same gas charges, which, when precisely triggered, will release a significant amount of gas, just like the kind of theatrical smoke you often see on a large stage during a performance.
The doctor shows chemical grenades and a drop container. All of this is dropped daily on the heads of our soldiers. The geography of their use stretches from Kharkiv region to Zaporizhzhia.
They use all kinds of poisonous gases, grenades, and drop devices. They throw them near dugouts, trying to get them inside somehow. This is a very dangerous thing. We are always on alert. We keep our gas mask ready if we hear anything. And you really have to listen carefully, because if there's a pop but no explosion, it becomes clear that it's something poisonous.
Chloropicrin, chloroacetophenone, and other tear, irritant, and suffocating agents. The occupiers load grenades with this kind of filling. This leads to burns of the skin, eyes, and respiratory tract, general poisoning of our soldiers, and even fatalities.
It paralyzes,
takes your breath away, everything stings, your eyes water. Russia used K-51 grenades with chloropicrin back during the war in Afghanistan. They were developed for dispersing mass gatherings and demonstrations. Now, with improved chemical compounds, the occupiers are poisoning our defenders all along the front line, forcing them to leave their shelters.
One way or another, this cannot be used. That is, the elements and substances used for dispersing demonstrations cannot be used during military conflicts. Therefore, in any case, this constitutes a violation. Although yes, I've even heard somewhere that the use of such elements in the classic sense can actually be regarded as chemical weapons.
The Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons has published a report. In just the past 2 years, there have been more than 9,000 cases of Russians using these chemical substances. More than 2,000 Ukrainian servicemen have suffered burns, poisoning, and have sought medical attention. Russia is blatantly violating the Chemical Weapons Convention. Moreover, the Russians were supposed to have disposed of such weapons back in 1997. Ukrainian diplomats have repeatedly appealed to the UN and relevant international organizations, providing evidence of Russians using chemical substances on the battlefield. They are demanding the creation of an international coalition to hold Moscow accountable for violating the Geneva Convention. The world traditionally responds to the use of chemical substances by Russian occupiers with confusion and concern. There is no clear answer on how to combat this on a large scale along the front line. Our military says that perhaps the only way is to strike the factories producing such substances. At the same time, gas masks remain almost the only possible protection for those directly on the front lines.
That's all for today. But very soon Front News will bring you new, unique reports from our journalists in the hottest spots of the war, gathered so that you know the truth. This was Volodymyr Tymoshenko with you. Take care of yourselves and your loved ones.